All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is July 8th, 2025, about 10:40 p.m. where I am right now. And this is part 4 of our 13th book in our Book to React series, Black Bolshevik, Autobiography of an Afro-American Communist, the autobiography of Haywood. And this is a book I've been waiting to read for a long-ass time. It's quite a tome. It's over 700 pages long. But so far, we've been able to knock out chapters 1 and 2, where he goes over his early life growing up in South Omaha. And then in chapter 2, he talked about his time serving in World War I for the U.S. Army, fighting against the evil Germans in France. And that was a very lively chapter as well. Chapter 2 ended with him reuniting with his older brother, who's 7 years his senior, who went through a much different experience while serving in World War I and came back and was a part of several radical groups and ended up joining the Communist Party. So I don't know where chapter 3 is going to go, but I have the assumption that Harry's older brother is going to influence him to join the Communist Party or get interested in Marxism and start analyzing the world through a Marxist lens. This is a very, very rare book. You can find a hard copy of this book on Amazon for over $640 US. In paperback, it's close to $50 US, or maybe even a bit more. It's all in pounds right here. So this is a very rare book, which is why we are reading it. Part of my Book to React series is to preserve literature that could possibly, go extinct or go out of print and no longer be found, even if it's on the internet. Sometimes things on the internet can be lost. I've been looking for a Zero video with Papa Roo for the past 10 years. I haven't been able to find it since I saw it. So lost media is a real thing, but we're going to try to preserve these texts from our ancestors. You can find this book on libcom.org for free. And the download link is right here. So whenever you're watching this, hopefully you're watching this at a time where it's still available online for free. If you're watching this video, possibly some form of the internet has survived. Anyway, we're going to be continuing our reading of Black Bolshevik, Haywood's autobiography by jumping into chapter 3. It's over, I believe, 40 pages long, so I'm more than certain we won't be able to finish it, but we will be reading live until about 12 p.m. or so. I'm then going to lay down, rest up, and get ready for my last class of the day. So, chapter 3, Searching for Answers. Back home in Chicago, I was soon working again as a waiter on the Michigan Central Railroad. As I have already mentioned, the first day of the bloody Chicago race riot, July 28, 1919, came while I was working on the Wolverine run-up through Michigan. When I arrived home from work that afternoon, the whole family greeted me emotionally. We were all there except for Otto. The disagreements I had with my father in the past were forgotten. Both my mother and sister were weeping. Everyone was keyed up and had been worrying about my safety and getting from the station to the house. Following our brief reunion, I tore loose from the family to find out what was happening outside. I went to the regimental armory at the 35th and Giles Avenue because I wanted to find some of my buddies from the regiment. The street, Old Forest Avenue, had recently been renamed in honor of Lieutenant Giles, a member of our outfit killed in France. I knew they would be planning an armed defense, and I wanted to get in on the action. I found them, and they told me of their plans. It was rumored that Irishmen from west of the Wentworth Avenue dividing line were planning to invade the ghetto that night, coming in across the tracks by way of 51st Street. We planned a defensive action to meet them. F the Irish. F the racist Irish. Some Irish are cool. I had an Irish homie in university. He was cool. Shout out to Malcolm McDowell, I believe his name, from Boston. Shout out to Boston, one of the great American cities, but unfortunately it's infested with racist Irish. Anyway, it was not surprising that defensive preparations were underway. There had been clashes before, often when white youths in athletic clubs invaded the black community. These clubs were really racist gangs, organized by city ward heelers and precinct captains. One of my guys from the regiment took us to the apartment of a friend. It had a good position overlooking 51st Street near State. Someone had brought a Browning submachine gun. He'd gotten it some time before, most likely from the regimental armory. We didn't ask where it had come from or the origin of the 1903 Springfield rifles, Army issue that appeared. We set to work mounting the submachine gun and set up watch for the invaders. Fortunately for them, they never arrived and we all returned home in the morning. The following day, it rained and the National Guard moved into the black community, so overt raids by whites did not materialize. Ours was not the only group which used its recent army training for self-defense of the black community. We heard rumors about another group of veterans who set up a similar ambush. On several occasions, groups of whites had driven a truck at breakneck speed up South State Street, in the heart of the black ghetto, with 6 or 7 men in the back firing indiscriminately at people on the sidewalks. The black veterans set up their ambush at 35th and State, waiting in a car with the engine running. When the whites on the truck came through, they pulled in behind and opened up with a machine gun. The truck crashed into a telephone pole at 39th Street. Most of the men in the truck had been shot down and the others fled. Among them were several Chicago police officers, off duty, of course. See, it's not new. It's not new. I know now we're waking up to the idea or the actual fact that many of our police departments are infested with open white supremacists, racists, Nazis, etc. But this has been happening for a long ass time. And one more thing I have to say, I've been saying this ever since I started reading this book. What I really like about it is that he puts it in perspective that many black men always maintain their own self-defense and maintain their own dignity in the faces of white aggression. It wasn't like how they show in the Hollywood movies with black men running with their tail between their legs, getting lynched and not doing anything about it. Nope, the black men throughout this story always fought back against white supremacy with physical force, which is a beautiful thing. All right, continuing here. I remember standing before the Angels Flats on 35th and Wabash, where the day before 4 blacks had been shot by police. It appeared that enraged blacks had set fire to the building and were attacking some white police officers when the latter fired on them. Along with other blacks, I gloated over the mysterious killing of 2 black cops with a history of viciousness in the black community. They had been found dead in an alley between State and Wabash. Undoubtedly, they had been killed by blacks who had taken advantage of the confusion to settle old scores with these black enforcers of the white man's law. Bars. Bewilderment and shock struck the black community as well. I had seen blacks standing before the burned out buildings of their former homes, trying to salvage whatever possible. Apparent on their faces was bewilderment and anger. The Chicago Rebellion of 1919 was a pivotal point in my life. Always I had been hot-tempered and never took any insults lying down. This was even more true after the war. I had walked out of a number of jobs because of my refusal to take any crap from anyone. My experiences abroad in the army and at home with the police left me totally disillusioned about being able to find any solutions to the racial problem through the help of the government. For I had seen that official agencies of the country were among the most racist and most dangerous to me and my people. I began to see that I had to fight. I had to commit myself to struggle against whatever it was that made racism possible. Racism, which erupted in the Chicago riot and the bombings and terrorist attacks which preceded it, must be eliminated. My spirit was not unique. It was shared by many young blacks at that time. The returned veterans and other young militants were all fighting back, and there was a lot to fight back against. Racism reached a high tide in the summer of 1919. This was the Red Summer, which included 26 race riots, actually pogroms against black people, across the country. Red for the blood that ran in the streets. Chicago was the bloodiest. The Holocaust in Chicago was the worst race riot in the nation's post-war history, but riots took place in such widely separate places as Longview, Texas, Charleston, South Carolina, Elaine, Arkansas, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Omaha, Nebraska. The flare-up of racial violence in Omaha, my old hometown, followed the Chicago riots by less than 2 months. It resulted in the lynching of Will Brown, a packing house worker, for an alleged assault on a white woman. When Omaha's mayor, Edward P. Smith, sought to intervene, he was seized by the mob. They were close to hanging the mayor from a trolley pole when police cut the rope and rushed him to a hospital, badly injured. The common underlying cause of riots in most of the northern cities was the racial tension caused by the migration of tens of thousands of blacks into these centers and the competition for jobs, housing, and the facilities of the city. Rather than being at a temporary peak, this outbreak of racism was more like the rising of a plateau. It never got any higher, but it never really went down either. Writing in the middle of a riot in Washington, D.C. that summer, the black poet Claude McKay caught the bitter and belligerent mood of many blacks. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal in death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. Powerful poem. Shout out to Claude McKay. I've heard that name before, but never read any of his poetry, and that's a beautiful poem. I kind of want to read it again. Let's read it one more time. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. And for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. Powerful poetry. The war and riots of the Red Summer of 1919 left me bitter and frustrated. I felt that I could never again adjust to the situation of black inequality. But how had it come about? Who was responsible? Chicago in the early 20s was an ideal place and time for the education of a black radical. As a result of the migration of blacks during World War I, the Chicago area came to have the largest concentration of black proletarians in the country. It was a major point of contact for these masses with the white labor movement and its advanced radical sector. In the 30s, it was to become a main testing ground for black and white labor unity. The city itself was the core of a vast urban industrial complex. Sprawling along the southeast shore of Lake Michigan, the area includes 5 Illinois counties and 2 in Indiana. The latter contains such industrial towns as East Chicago, Gary, and Hammond. The metropolitan area contains the greatest concentration of heavy industry in the country. By the second half of the 20th century, it had forged into the lead of the steel-making industry, surpassing the great Monongahela Valley of Pittsburgh in the production of primary metals, including steel mill, refining, and non-ferrous metals operations. There was the gigantic U.S. Steel Corporation in Gary, the Inland Steel Company plant in East Chicago, and the U.S. Steel South Works. These are now the 3 largest steel works in the United States. The steel mills of the Chicago area supply more than 14,000 manufacturing plants. Chicago was, at that time, and remains today, the world's largest railway center. It ranks first in the manufacture of railroad equipment, including freight and passenger cars, Pullmans, locomotives, and specialized rolling stock. The core city itself was most famous for its wholesale slaughter and meat packing industry. Chicago was known as the meat capital of the world, or in Carl Sandburg's more homely terms, hog butcher for the nation. The city's colossal wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few men who comprised the industrial, commercial, and financial oligarchy. Among these were such giants as Judge Gary of the mighty U.S. Steel, Cyrus McCormick of International Harvester, the meat packers Philip D. Armour, Gustavus Swift, and the Wilson brothers, George Pullman and Pullman Works, Rosenwald of Montgomery Ward, General Wood of Sears and Roebuck, and the merchant prince, Marshall Field, and Samuel Insull of Utilities. These were the real rulers. Ostensible political power rested in the notoriously corrupt, gangster-ridden county political machine headed by Mayor William Hale, Big Bill Thompson, who carried on the tradition as early as 1903 by Lincoln Stevens in his book, The Shame of the Cities. The glitter and wealth of Chicago's Gold Coast was based on the most inhuman exploitation of the city's largely foreign-born working force. A scathing indictment of the horrible conditions in Chicago's meatpacking industry was contained in Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, published in 1910. It was inevitable that the wage slave would rebel, that Chicago should become the scene of some of the nation's bloodiest battles in the struggle between labor and capital. The first of these clashes was the railroad strike of 1877, which erupted in pitched battles between strikers and federal troops. Then in 1886 came the famous Haymarket riot, which grew out of a strike for the 8-hour day at the McCormick Reaper plant. During a protest rally, a bomb was thrown, which killed 1 policeman and injured 6 others. This led to the arrest of 8 anarchist leaders. 4 were hanged and 1 committed suicide or was murdered in his cell, and the others were sentenced to life imprisonment. Obviously, being tried and executed simply because they were labor leaders, these innocent men became a cause celebre of international labor. The thousands of visitors made yearly pilgrimages to the city, where monuments to the executed men were raised. Haymarket became a rallying word for the 8-hour day. The martyrs were memorialized by the designation of the 1st of May as International Labor Day. Several years later, the city was the scene of the Great Pullman Strike led by Eugene V. Debs and his radical but lily-white American Railway Union, which precipitated a nationwide shutdown of railroads in 1894. I didn't know Eugene V. Debs, famous, I believe Debs was like a socialist. I didn't know he was on that lily-white stuff, meaning that he wanted his movement to be nothing but white men involved. I didn't know Eugene V. Debs was on that. I need to look that up. So, again, the federal troops were called in the armed clashes between workers and troops ensued. These battles were merely high points in the city's long history of labor radicalism. It was the national center of the early anarcho-socialist movements. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or Wobblies, was founded here. The IWW maintained its headquarters and edited its paper, Solidarity, there. In 1921, Chicago was to become the site of the founding convention of the Workers, or Communist Party, USA, which maintained its headquarters and its editorial offices of the Daily Worker there from 1923 to 1927. Blacks, however, played little or no role in the turbulent early history of the Chicago labor movement. This was so simply because they were not part of the industrial labor force. Prior to World War I, blacks were employed mainly in the domestic or personal service occupations, untouched by labor organizations. They were not needed in industry where the seemingly endless tide of cheap European immigrant labor, Irish, Scots, English, Swedes, Germans, Poles, East Europeans, and Italians, sufficed to fill the city's manpower needs. The only opportunity blacks had of entering basic industry was as strike breakers. Thus, in the early part of the century, blacks were brought in as strike breakers on 2 important occasions: the Stockyards Strike of 1904 and the citywide Teamsters Strike in 1905. In the first instance, blacks were discharged as soon as the strike was broken. After the Teamsters Strike, a relatively large number of blacks remained. As a result of the defeat of the 1904 strike, the packing houses remained virtually unorganized for 13 more years, and the animosities which developed toward the black strikebreakers became a part of the racial tension of the city. This is an example of how the capitalist class divides the working class along the lines of race. So black people weren't allowed to work in the factories, whether explicitly or implicitly, because blacks were seen as, just domestic servants. Until the whites, who were working in the manufacturing plants, said, we want to go on strike to not have to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week, etc. So then the capitalists say, hey, black people, hey, we want you to work in the factories. And now the angry white folks who were trying to get better wages, which was their right to do, are now mad at black folks. And then also on top of that, they build on top of that more racism towards the people that are strike breakers. So this is just an example. Let this be a lesson to everybody. What we're seeing right now in the country, where many white Americans and black Americans and also Hispanic Americans as well are being very xenophobic and nationalistic towards the illegal immigrants within the country. This is all an old strategy that the capitalist class used to divide the working class. They don't want to give us better wages. They don't want to give us health care. They don't want to give us actual livable wages and things like that. So let's just have the working class fight among who gets our shitty jobs. Who wants to pick strawberries for $9 an hour? Let's turn the poor whites and the poor blacks against the Latino immigrants that do want to be our slaves. You get what I'm saying? So let's continue here. At the outbreak of World War I, the situation with respect to Chicago's black labor underwent a basic change. Act D says, preach. Yeah, we out here reading, learning, and also preaching and teaching. Well, let's continue here. At the outbreak of World War I, the situation with respect to Chicago's black labor underwent a basic change. Now blacks were needed to fill the labor vacuum caused by the war boom and the quotas on foreign immigration. Chicago's employers turned to the South, to the vast and untapped reservoir of black labor eager to escape the conditions of plantation serfdom. Exacerbated by the cotton crisis, the boll weevil plague, and the wave of lynchings, the Great Migration began and continued in successive waves through the 60s. During the war, the occupational status of blacks thus shifted from largely personal service to basic industry. In the tens of thousands, blacks flocked to the stockyards and steel mills. During the war, the black population went from 50,000 to 100,000. Successive waves of black migration were to bring the black population to over 1 million within the next 50 years. That's incredible. That's a large amount of people. Imagine, like, Chicago or any city. Imagine Budapest, Hungary. Imagine Budapest, Hungary, and then with over the span of like a few decades, 1 million black people moved to Budapest, Hungary. Now, finally, maybe Budapest will have better dance clubs and nightclubs and better music will be played, and maybe the food will get a little bit better. But imagine the backlash to 1 million black folks moving to Budapest, Hungary. And now picture that in Chicago in America during like the beginning of the 20th century, right? So that's something to like put in your mind. Anyway, successive waves of black migration were to bring the black population to over 1 million within the next 50 years. Black labor getting its first foothold in basic industry during the war had now become an integral part of Chicago's industrial labor force. With the tapping of the vast reservoir of cheap and unskilled labor, there was no longer any need for the peasantry of Eastern and Southern Europe. There was, however, a difference between the position of blacks and that of the European immigrants. The latter, after a generation or two, could rise to higher skilled and better paying jobs, to administrative and even managerial positions. So basically the poor whites that came from Poland, or the poor Frenchman that came, his son was going to be the manager. And his grandson was going to be the owner of an industry one day. Meanwhile, that poor black man and his son and his grandson stayed at the same level economically. So they were able to leave the ethnic enclaves and disperse throughout the city to become assimilated into the national melting pot. The blacks, to the contrary, found themselves permanently relegated to a second-class status in the labor force, with a large group outside as a permanent surplus labor pool to be replenished when necessary from the inexhaustible reservoir of black poverty-ridden and land-starved peasantry of the South. The employers now had in hand a new source of cheap labor, the victims of racist proscription, to use as a weapon against the workers' movement. Indeed, this went hand in hand with the Jim Crow policies of the trade union leaders, who had been largely responsible for keeping blacks out of basic industry in the first place. These labor bureaucrats premised their racism on the doctrine of a natural black inferiority. The theory of an instinctive animosity between the races was a powerful instrument for an anti-union, anti-working class divide and rule policy. The use of racial differences was found to be a much more effective dividing instrument than the use of cultural and language differences between various white ethnic groups and the native-born. As we have known, ethnic conflicts proved transient as the various European nationalities became assimilated into the general population. Blacks, on the other hand, remain to this day permanently unassimilable under the present system. Such were conditions in the days when I undertook my search for answers to the question of black oppression and the road to liberation. Living conditions were pretty rough then, and I had gone back to my old trade of waiting tables in order to make some sort of living. But I was restless, moody, short-tempered, qualities ill-suited to the trade. Naturally, I had trouble holding a job. My trouble was not with the guests so much as with my immediate superiors, captains, head waiters, and dining car stewards, most of whom were whites. In less than a month after the Chicago riot, I lost my job on the Michigan Central as a result of a run-in with an inspector. The dining car inspectors were a particularly vicious breed. Their job was to see that discipline was maintained and service kept up to par. These inspectors, whom we called company spies, would board the train unexpectedly anywhere along the route, hoping to catch a member of the crew violating some regulation or not giving what they considered proper service. They would then reprimand the guilty party personally, or if the offense was sufficiently serious, would turn him in to the main office to be laid off or fired. Usually the inspector's word was law from which there was no appeal. The dining car crew had no unions in those days. This particular inspector, his name was McCormick, had taken a dislike to me. He had made that clear on other occasions. The feeling was mutual. Perhaps he sensed my independent attitude. He probably felt I was not sufficiently impressed by him and did not care about my job. He was right on both counts. It's funny how whenever you have a shitty job, that one manager, there's always just one manager that knows you hate your job, and then they try to make you hate it even more so you can leave. Maybe that's why they got the big bucks and we are stuck at the bottom. They're the managers for a reason. They know who is not fit for this, so they're trying to pluck you out of that thing. But it's always funny how things don't seem to change, because that paragraph could have been copy and pasted on somebody's like Facebook post about their current shitty job at, I don't know, Family Dollar. Continuing here. He boarded the Chicago-bound train one morning in Detroit. We were serving breakfast. It was just one of those days when everything went wrong. People were lined up at each end of the diner, waiting to be served. Service was slow. The guests were squawking, and I was in a mean mood myself. I was cutting bread in the pantry when McCormick peered in and shouted, "Say, Hall, that silver is in terrible condition." The silver? What the hell is this man talking about, dirty silver, when I've got all these people out there clamoring for their breakfast? I've been noticing you lately, he continued. It looks as though you don't want to work. If you don't like your job, why in the hell don't you quit? See, I told you. I took that as downright provocation. Damn you and your job, I exploded, advancing on him. He turned pale and ran out of the pantry. A friend of mine in the crew grabbed me by the wrist. What the hell's the matter with you, Hall? Are you crazy? It was only then that I realized that I had been waving the bread knife at the inspector. In a few minutes, the brakeman and the conductor came into the pantry. McCormick brought up the rear. "That's the one," he said, pointing at me. Addressing me, the conductor said, "The inspector here says you threatened him with a knife. Is that true?" I denied it, stating that I had been cutting bread when the argument started and had a knife in my hand. I wasn't threatening him with it. My friend, who had grabbed my wrist, substantiated my story. "Well," said the conductor, "you'd better get your things and ride to Chicago in the coach. We don't want any more trouble here, and the inspector has said he doesn't want you in the dining car." I went up forward in the coach. I got off the train in Chicago at 63rd and Stony Island. I didn't go to the downtown station, thinking that the cops might be waiting there. So much for my job with the Michigan Central. I went back to working sporadically in restaurants, hotels, and on trains. I didn't stay anywhere very long. The first job that I regarded as steady was the Illinois Athletic Club, where I remained for several months. I was beginning to settle down a little and participate in the social life of the community, attending dances, parties, and visiting cabarets. The Royal Gardens, a nightclub on the 31st Street, was one of my favorite hangouts. King Oliver and Louis Armstrong were often featured there. At the Panama on 35th Street between State and Wabash, we went to see our favorite comedians, Butterbeans and Susie. Okay, all right. It was on one of these occasions that I met my first wife. Okay, player from the Himalaya. Okay. It was on these occasions that I met my first wife, Hazel. She belonged to Chicago's black social elite, such as it was. Her father had died and her family was on the downgrade. Her mother was left with 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, of whom Hazel was the oldest. Hazel sounds like the name of a very bad broad. She was probably bad as hell. The other children were still teenagers, and Hazel and her mother had supported them by doing domestic work and catering for wealthy whites. I was 21 and she was 25. Okay, see, there are so many things that mirror my life in this book, which I find very weird. I feel like to some degree, Haywood Hall, I feel like maybe I'm him reincarnated. Am I Harry Haywood reincarnated? Because there's so much of his life that mirrors mine. Now, granted, I didn't go to war, but I did go to France. he got married once before and then got divorced. You know what I mean? He grew up in a mixed community with different people, but was still treated differently because he was black, and he ended up becoming a freaking communist. Am I Harry Haywood reincarnated? Because there's so much in this book that mirrors parts of my life, which are crazy, and especially because my first wife was older than me. My first wife was older than me, and I think about the same amount of time. I think my first wife, if I remember right, was about 3 years older than me, which is not that far off from him being 21 and his first wife being 25. Very interesting. Very interesting. I might be him reincarnated. He died in 1985. I was born 5 years later. Hey, I'm going to just take that. Harry Haywood reincarnated. So Hazel was attractive. I knew it. She was batty. A high school graduate. Oh, she was smart too. She spoke good English. And, as mother said, had good manners. She worked for Montgomery Ward, then owned by the philanthropic Rosenwald family, the first big company to hire blacks as office clerks. She had a nice singing voice and used to sing around at parties. Her friends were among the black upper strata, and the family belonged to the Episcopal Church on 38th and Wabash, which at that time was the church of the colored elite. We were married in 1920. I was all decked out in rented swallowtail coat, striped pants, spats, and a derby. The ceremony was impressive. Photos appeared in the Chicago Defender. In a short time, the romance wore off. Hazel's ambition to get ahead in the world, to be somebody, clashed with my love of freedom. I soon had visions of myself, a quarter century hence, making mortgage payments on a fancy house, installments on furniture, and trapped in a drab, lower middle class existence, surrounded by a large and quarrelsome family. So he imagined his life as Family Matters. He imagined living. He married a rich girl and then let it go. He married a rich girl, then let it go. I don't know how to feel about that. I respect it. I respect it. And once again, it's on brand. I said this before about Angela Davis's communist political autobiography. A lot of the communist, autobiographies are written in the intent of always showing that they had some, bent towards the ideals of Marxism. You get what I'm saying? And when you read Angela Davis's book, it's like a soldier's story, and this too, in some ways, mirrors that. Because why would you just say, oh yeah, I gave up this beautiful rich girl because I didn't want to be rich. My whole life, I always despised being rich. Like, it's a bit too, on the nose. This book is not as on the nose as Angela Davis's book, but it still has those moments, and that paragraph right there is one. All right. So the worst of it was having to put up with being kicked around on the job and taking all that crap from head waiters and captains. I had been working at the athletic club for several months before I got married. Then nobody had bothered me. When I asked for time off to get married, the white head waiter and the captain seemed delighted. Sure, Hall, that's fine. Congratulations. Take a couple of weeks off. Upon my return, I immediately felt a change in their attitude. Now that I was married, they felt they had me where they wanted me. They became more and more demanding. One day at lunch, I had some difficulty getting my orders out of the kitchen, and the guests were complaining. Not an unusual occurrence in any restaurant. Instead of helping me out and calming down the guests or seeing what the hang-up was in the kitchen, the captain started shouting at me in front of the guests. What's the matter with you, Hall? Why don't you bring these people's orders? Can't you see that I'm tied up in the kitchen? I said. Why don't you go out and see the chef instead of hollering at me? All puffed up, he yelled out, "Don't give me any of your lip or I'll snatch that badge off you." I jerked my badge off, threw both badge and side towel into his face and shouted, "Take your badge and shove it." Okay. I was moving on him when a friend of mine, Johnson, a waiter at the next station, jumped between us. I turned away, walked down the steps, through the kitchen, and into the dressing room. Johnson followed me into the dressing room a few minutes later. "Hurry up and get out of here. They're calling the cops." I changed and left. My marriage went down the drain along with the job. That was a period of post-war crisis. Jobs were hard to find, and especially so for me, since I had been blacklisted from several places because of my temper. I was no longer the same man that Hazel married, and the truth of the matter was that I wanted it that way. Her hang-ups were typical of black aspirants for social status. Strivers, we called them, who never really doubted the validity of the prejudice from which they suffered. Hazel slavishly accepted white middle-class values. I, on the other hand, was looking around trying to figure out how best to maladjust. Okay, so he was always, fighting the trends, rebel, you know what I mean? It sounded like Tupac married Janet Jackson. You know what I mean? It sounds like, I don't know, Huey P. Newton got engaged to, like, I don't know, Mariah Carey. You know what I mean? The math wasn't mathing. They say opposites attract, but sometimes being too opposite in a relationship can break those bonds. Anyway, my rebellion for me, the breakup of our marriage in the spring of 1920 destroyed my last ties with the old conventional way of life. I was completely disenchanted with the middle class crowd into which Hazel was trying to draw me. But more important, I not only rejected the status quo, I was determined to do something about it to make my rebellion count. At least he didn't have kids, by the way. Which is surprising because back then our ancestors, as soon as they got married, you were pregnant the next week. Anyway, I sought answers to a number of questions. What was the nature of the forces behind black subjugation? Who were its main beneficiaries? Why was racism being entrenched in the North in this period? How did it differ from the South? Could the situation be altered? And if so, what were the forces for change in the program? I renewed my search for a way to go, pressed by a driving need for a worldview which would provide a rational explanation of society and a clue to securing black freedom and dignity. My search was to continue during what must have been the most virulent and widespread racist campaign in U.S. history. The forces of racist bigotry unleashed during the riots of the Red Summer of 1919 were still on the march through the 20s. Indeed, they had intensified and extended their campaign. The whole country seemed gripped in a frenzy of racist hate. Anti-black propaganda was carried in the press, in magazine article, literature, and in theater. D.W. Griffith's obscene movie, The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan and pictured blacks as depraved animals, was shown to millions. Thomas Dixon's two novels, The Klansman, upon which Griffith's picture was based, and The Leopard Spots, an earlier book on the theme of the white man's burden, were bestsellers. Racist demagogues of the stripe of Pitchfork, Ben Tillman of South Carolina, Vardaman of Mississippi, and Cotton Ed Smith of South Carolina were in demand on northern lecture platforms. Closely behind the trumpeters of race hate rode their cavalry. A revived Ku Klux Klan now extended to the north and made its appearance in 27 states. This organization, embracing millions, headed the list of a whole rash of superior patriotic groups who were anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-foreign-born, and anti-black. The apostles of white Anglo-Saxon and Nordic supremacy included in their galaxy of ethnic outcasts. Asians, the yellow peril, Latin Americans and their foreign-born from Southern and Eastern Europe. Their hate propaganda pitted Protestants against Catholics, Christians against Jews, native against foreign-born, and all against the blacks, upon whom was fixed the stigma of inherent and eternal inferiority. It seemed as though the prophets of the lost cause were out to reverse their military defeat at Appomattox by the cultural subversion of the North. That they were receiving encouragement by powerful Northern interests was self-evident. Tin Pan Alley added its contribution to the attack with the spate of Mammy songs, and along the same vein, That's Why Darkies Were Born. Okay, I'm not going to read this. I like the songs here in this text, but I'm not going to read this. I'm not going to read that because just looking at it and the title is racist as hell. So, all right. Anyway, Black Bolshevik, continuing here, page 94. A main objective of the racist assault was the academic establishment. The old crude forms of racist propaganda proved inadequate in an age of advancing science. The hucksters of race hate conducted raids upon the sciences, especially upon the new disciplines, anthropology, ethnology, and of course, psychology, in an attempt to establish a scientific foundation for the race myth. The new science of race evolved and flourished during this period. Hold on. Okay, hold on. Sorry, I thought the connection stopped. All right, continuing here. All right. Sorry, I thought the connection stopped. All right. So anyway, the old crude forms of racist propaganda proved inadequate in an age of advancing science. The hucksters of race hate conducted raids upon the sciences, especially upon the new disciplines, anthropology, ethnology, and of course, psychology, in an attempt to establish a scientific foundation for the race myth. The new science of race evolved and flourished during the period. Spade work for this grotesque growth had been done in the middle of the last century by the Frenchman Count Arthur de Gobineau. I wrote a paper about him. I don't know if I should publish it on my channel, but I wrote a paper about Gobineau. He is basically like the inventor of race science. Very interesting fellow, and the archetype of the insecure white man finding ways to uplift himself. All right. So The Inequality of the Human Races was written by Arthur de Gobineau. It was carried on by his disciples, the Englishman turned German Houston Chamberlain, who asserted that racial mixture was a natural crime. In the U.S., early efforts in this field were the works of Knott and Glyden. Also, there was Ripley's Races of Mankind. Carrying on in this pseudoscientific tradition during the war and post-war years were the popular theorist Lothrop Stoddard, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, and Madison Grant, The Passing of a Great Race, The Racial Basis of European History. The cornerstone of this pseudoscientific structure was social Darwinism, which was an attempt to subvert Darwin's theory of evolution and arbitrarily apply natural selection in plant and animal society to human society. According to the social Darwinists led by Herbert Spencer, the British sociologist Herbert Spencer. According to the social Darwinists led by Herbert Spencer, the British sociologist, history was a continuous struggle for existence between races. In this struggle, the Nordic, Anglo-Saxon, or Aryan civilizations naturally survived as the fittest. The sad thing is I'm studying sociology out here in Budapest, Hungary, and that name, Herbert Spencer, has come up before. And I'm more than certain that Herbert Spencer has been brought up in a positive way, as if he contributed positively to sociology. The racists had a field day in history, long the area in which the heroes of the lost cause had their greatest, most effective concentration. They had held chairs in some of the nation's most prestigious universities, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, etc. Among such historians was William Archibald Dunning, who during his long tenure at Columbia miseducated generations of students by his distortions of the Reconstruction, Civil War, and slave periods. In the academic world, this pseudoscience of racism held sway with only a few open challengers. The latter seemed to be isolated voices in the wilderness. As the counteroffensive was slow in getting underway. In anthropology, there was Franz Boas's anti-racist thrust, Mind of Primitive Man. This was written in 1911 and not widely known at the time. The works of his students and colleagues, most notably Melville Hershovitz, The Myth of the Negro Past, Jane Weltfish, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and Otto Kleinberg, were not to appear until the next decade. In history, the movement for revision was then decades away. It only became a trend with the Black Revolt of the 60s. Black scholars had pioneered the re-examination, W.B. Du Bois, his tour de force, Black Reconstruction, and the epilogue Propaganda of History, which contained a bitter indictment of the white historical establishment, was not to appear until the mid-30s. J.A. Rogers, popular Black historian, had not yet appeared on the scene. Young Carter Woodson, who had founded his Association for the Study of Negro History in 1915, only began to publish the Journal of Negro History in 1916. His own important historical works were yet to come. See, this is why, all of that might sound very boring and tedious for people, but it's very important that people realize how knowledge is disseminated, and the popularity of certain types of knowledge is very important on how we view the world. Right? For a long time in American history and also world history, generations of people were educated to believe certain ways that history was done, psychology was done, sociology was done, that inherently put whites at the top and other groups of people in different categories going down to blacks being at the bottom. The way we study history is also important to how we analyze the knowledge that has been transmitted, and it's also important that we're critical of the people that we're told are the forefathers of our fields, whether that be anthropology, psychology, sociology, etc. It's important for the humanities to self-examine the people that created or laid the foundation of these fields, right? But I'll continue here. Thus, from its tap roots in the southern plantation system, the anti-black virus had spread throughout the country, shaping the pattern of black-white relations in the industrial urban North as well. The dogma of the inherent inferiority of blacks had permeated the national consciousness to become an integral part of the American way of life. Racist dogma, first a rationale for chattel slavery and then plantation peonage, was now carried over to the North as justification for a new system of de facto segregation. Black subjugation, city-style Jim Crow, became fixed by the 20s and continues up to the present day. Its components were the residential segregation of the ghetto with its inferior education, slums, and the second-class status of black workers in the labor force, where they were relegated to the bottom rung of the occupational ladder and prevented by discrimination from moving into better skills and higher-paid jobs. Although its purpose was not clear to me then, I later realized that the virulent racism of the period served to justify and bulwark the structure of black powerlessness, which was developing in every northern city, which we had become a sizable portion of the workforce. Okay. Shout out to Kamal in the chat. Pounds to Kamal. Comrade Kamal, leader of the Defense from Crackerdom League. Send your applications to him. Continuing here in Black Bolshevik, page 96. At the time, the racist deluge simply revealed great gaps in my own education and knowledge. I knew that the propaganda was a tissue of lies, but I felt the need for disproving them on the basis of scientific fact. I rejected racism, the lie of the existence and nature of superior and inferior races, and its concomitant fiction of intuitive hostility between races. For one thing, it ran counter to my own background of experience in Omaha. Religion as an explanation for the riddles of the universe I had rejected long before. I knew that our predicament was not the result of some divine disposition, and therefore that racial oppression was neither a spiritual or natural phenomenon. It was created by man, and therefore must be changed by man. How? Well, that was the question to be explored. I had only a smattering of knowledge of natural and social sciences, much of which I had gathered through reading the lectures of Robert G. Ingersoll. It was through him that I discovered Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution through natural selection. Armed with a dictionary and a priori knowledge gleaned from Ingersoll's popularizations, I was able to make my way through Origin of the Species. Darwin showed the origin of the species to be a result of the process of evolution and not the mysterious act of a divine creation. Here at last was a scientific refutation of religious dogma. I had at last found a basis for my atheism, which had long before been based mainly upon practical knowledge. Continuing my search, I found myself attracted to other social iconoclasts or image destroyers, and to their attacks upon established beliefs. I remember staying up all night reading Max Nordau's Conventional Lies of Our Civilization, being thrilled by his castigation of middle-class hypocrisy, prejudices, and Philistinism. Moving on to the contemporary scene, I discovered H.L. Mencken, the sage of Baltimore, and his smart set crowd. For a short while, I was an avid reader of the Mercury, which he helped to establish in 1920 as a forum for his views. I was particularly delighted by his critical potshots at some of the most sacred cultural cows of what he called the American Babbitry, boobocracy, anthropoid majority. What? Okay, English please. Menckenian sobriquets for middle-class commoners. Mencken enjoyed a brief popularity among young black radicals of the day who saw in his searing diatribes against WASP cultural idols ammunition with which to blast the claims of white supremacists. The novelty soon wore off as it became clear that Mencken's type of iconoclasm posed no real challenge to the prevailing social structure. In fact, it was reactionary. He sought to replace destroyed idols with even more reactionary ones, as I soon found out. Okay, it sounds like, number one, he's talking about people that are long dead and gone and whose cultural imprint on, American discourse has faded into obscurity in history. But the way he's describing Mencken and the other people that he's reading, that are shaping his worldview, they basically sound like, liberals. They basically sound like the Bill Maher types of the world, right? They're poking holes at the myths and lies of the American dream and the American cultural, superculture, etc. But at the same time, they don't really want to shake the boat too much. That's what he's getting at here. right? I'm trying to read in between the lines because many of these people that he's pointing out are from well over 100 years ago. So, of course, most Americans haven't heard of them. And even though I'm pretty well read, I haven't heard of some of these people he's mentioning. But continuing here. Mencken's philosophical mentor was none other than the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, prophet of the Superman, of the aristocratic minority destined to rule over the unenlightened hordes of Untermensch, the perennially and inherently unequal majority of mankind. Most blacks then, including myself, who flirted with Mencken, never accepted him fully. The one exception was George Schuler of the Pittsburgh Courier, who took Mencken's snobbery and reactionary politics and made a career of them which has lasted for 40 years. What confused me most were the contentions of the social Darwinists, who claimed to be the authentic continuators of Darwin's theories. Darwin had not dealt with the question of race per se, but it had seemed to me that his theory of evolution precluded the myth of race. How could Darwin's theory, which had helped me finally and irrevocably throw aside the veil of mysticism and put the understanding of the descent of man within my grasp, how could this be used as an endorsement of racism? Perhaps I had been wrong. Was I reading into Darwin more than what he implied? It was my brother Otto who finally cleared me up on this point. He and I were running in different circles, but we would meet from time to time and exchange notes. Otto pointed out that social Darwinists had distorted Darwin by mechanically transferring the laws of existence among plants and animals to the field of social and human relations. Human society had its own laws, he asserted. What were the laws? That was the subject that I wanted to explore. You ought to quit reading those bourgeoisie authors and start reading Marx and Engels. I knew it. Otto would come through. It's similar to Malcolm X's story. If you read Malcolm X's autobiography, it was his brother, not in the movie. In the movie, they make it seem like there was this brother in prison that, influenced Malcolm X to convert to Islam. But really, it was Malcolm X's brother that put him on. You get what I'm saying? And similarly, Otto, Harry Haywood's older brother, and I wish there was a picture of the family so we could have faces to put with these names. But it was Harry Haywood's older brother Otto who put him on game, put him on Marx, and led him down the path of total realization. He exits the cave. He exits the cave with his brother holding his hand. Beautiful. So, Otto told me, suggesting also that I read Henry Louis Morgan's Ancient Society and the works of Redpath. About this time, I got a job as a clerk at the Chicago Post Office. I heard that jobs were available and that veterans were given preference. Following the advice of friends, I approached S.L. Jackson of the Wabash Avenue YMCA, who at that time was a black Republican stalwart with connections in the Madden political machine. Jackson gave me a note for some post office official in charge of employment. I passed the civil service examination in which veterans were given a 10% advantage and was employed as a substitute clerk. All right. Shout out to Kamal, dropping Otto, superhero. All right. The post office job in those days carried considerable prestige. It was almost the only clerical job open to blacks. Postal workers, along with waiters, Pullman porters, and tradesmen, were traditionally considered a part of the black middle class. A number of prominent community leaders came from this group. Many officers of the old 8th Illinois were postal employees, a good percentage of them mail carriers. I would be scared as hell to be a black mail carrier during that time. I wonder, maybe he'll explain this later. Do you think delivering mail was also segregated? So if you're a black mailman, can you walk into a all-white neighborhood and deliver mail? Do you think that was allowed back then? I don't know. What do y'all think in the chat? Do you think in the chat that a black mailman back in like the 1920s could go into an all-white neighborhood to do his job? And if he could do that, do you think he would do that? If you have the job of picking your routes, would you say, yeah, you know where I'm going to go today? Levittown. You know what I mean? Like, nah, I wouldn't do that. Anyway, the post office became a refuge for poor black students and unemployed university graduates. For some of the latter, it was a sort of way station on the road to their professional careers. Others remained settling for regular post office careers. But even here, opportunities were limited. Blacks held only a few supervisory positions as advancement depended solely on the discretion of the white postmaster. Interesting. So this is why I think, I'm going to talk about this and let me know what y'all think. In fact, We might make this a question to put in the chat. We might make this a question. I have a question for the people out there. Should the government guarantee jobs? I would say yes. Because in this case, right, there were these black veterans coming home from World War II, had nowhere to go because the private sector was hella racist. There are also these black students who got these advanced degrees that want to work in their fields but can't do that in the private sector because it's hella racist. So why doesn't the government step in and provide guaranteed jobs for the people? Not just for black people, but for everybody. I think in a modern advanced economy, there should be no reason for an employment rate. So I'm going to ask the people, should the government guarantee jobs? I would like to know what the people think. I would like to know what the people think. Should the government guarantee every single person a job? Put it in the chat. We'll check it at the end of the live stream. Okay? We got one vote for yes. I'm pretty sure that's Kamal. And I would like to know why people think the government shouldn't offer everybody a job. And there's plenty of things that the government can put people to work to do, such as, I don't know, fixing potholes in the street, picking up trash, I don't know, working in soup kitchens to feed people, helping people work on construction projects, delivery, mail jobs. You get what I'm saying? Like, the government could be involved in so many ways of making people's lives better. But we seem to be in this, neoliberal mindset where we think everybody's for themselves. Everybody's for themselves, no guarantees. You pick out your lifestyle to the best of your ability. And if you fail or if you make some choices or some accidents happen to you, well, you're shit out of luck. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, I'm going to continue here. So on the job, I found the work extremely boring. It consisted of standing before a case 8 hours a night sorting mail. All substitutes were relegated to the night shift. It took years to get on the day shift, which was preempted by the veteran employees. On the other hand, I found the company of my new young fellow workers very stimulating. In those days, the organization of black postal employees was the Phalanx Forum. Before the war, the organization had played an important political and social role in the community. It was dominated by the conservative crowd of social climbers and political aspirants, who were the most active group among postal employees and had close ties with the local Republican machine. Their leadership was completely ineffective with respect to the job issues of black rank-and-file employees, and it had little or no influence over the younger group of new employees, which included many veterans and students. The gap between the old conservative crowd and the new, youthful element was sharp. Among the latter, of radical sentiment was growing. I was immediately attracted to this group, among whom I was to find friends, who seemed to be impelled by the same motivations as myself, to find new answers to the problems afflicting our people. Most of those with whom I fraternized considered the postal job as temporary, a step to other careers. Our interest at the time, therefore, was not so much with the immediate economic or the on-the-job needs of black postal workers, but with the race problem generally. The drive for unionization of postal employees was to come later. That sounds like such a cool setting for a play or a novel. Imagine a bunch of young, black men of different backgrounds working the night shift at a post office, right? And that could be a dope movie. Let's make that a movie. And let's put all of our all-star black actors right now. Let's get Michael B. Jordan. Let's get Jonathan Majors. Let's get Damson Idris, my guy. Let's get, let's get Lil Meech from the BMF show. Why not? Let's get a bunch of different black folks of different walks of life, all sorting mail in the night shift as they talk and rant and debate and fight over, the ideas of the race problem or ideas of what it means to be black in this world, etc. Sounds like a very dope play. Like One Night at the Post Office is what we'll call it. And it's starring Jonathan Majors, Michael B. Jordan, Damson Idris, and Lil Meech from the BMF show. Okay? Let's do that. Anyway, the issue to which we addressed ourselves was the current campaign of white racist propaganda, how to counter it on the basis of scientific truth. We saw the network of racist lies as clearly aimed at justifying black subjugation and destroying our dignity as a people. On this question, we had long, endless discussions on the job while sorting mail, at rest, during lunch breaks, and on Sundays when some of us would meet. I soon identified with what I considered the more vocal segment. Among our group of aspirant intellectuals, there was a medical student, a couple of law students, a dentist, whom we called Doc, students of education, and some intellectually oriented workers like myself. On one Sunday, when we had gathered, it was suggested, I think by Joe Mabley, that we organize ourselves as an informal discussion group, and that our purpose would be to answer the racist lies on the basis of scientific truth. The idea was instantly agreed upon. The discussion circle was loosely organized, not more than a dozen participants in all, and bent on finding answers. The moving spirit of the group were John Heath, Joe Mabley, and Doc. Heath was a tall, light-complexioned man with high cheekbones. He was a graduate student in the field of education and a man whose sterling character and keen intellect we all respected. Page 100. Page 100. Whenever we make it to page 100, we take a shot. Anyway, then there was Joe Mabley, a brilliant, small black man. He had large, velvety eyes. How do you have velvety eyes? And was a college dropout. He was married and had a family, 2 or 3 children, and had settled down to a regular post office job. He and Doc were the only regular postal workers in our group, the rest of us being substitutes. Doc had set up an office on the south side and was trying hard to build up a clientele while working night shifts. Originally, we had planned to meet every Sunday at noon as the most convenient time for the fellows on our shift. The meeting places were to alternate between the homes or apartments of the members. When we got to procedure, the group would choose a topic of discussion and ask for volunteers or assign a member to make introductory reports. He would then have a week to prepare that report. Our original plans included the eventual organization of a forum in which the issues of the day could be debated and the holding of social affairs. All of this proved to be too ambitious. We found it impractical to have weekly meetings and finally agreed that twice a month was more feasible. The forum idea never got off the ground. Okay, a little bit of organic organizing. I like that. Anyway, among us, I think we had the most of the answers on the question of race. All right? Hold on, wait. Let me make sure the live is still going. All right. Let me make sure the live is still going. Hold on. Let me make sure this thing is still going, still working. All right, hold on. Let me make sure we're still rocking. Let me make sure we're still live. Okay. A bit of organic organizing. All right, yeah, we're still live. We're still live. I thought it stopped because my phone stopped. Anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, among us, I think we had most of the answers on the question of race. That is, to all but the big lie, the one that was most convincing to the white masses and is the cornerstone on which the whole structure stood or fell, the assertion that blacks have no history. A leading formulator of the lie at that time was John Burgess, professor of political science and history at Columbia University. The claim that there is nothing in the color of the skin from the point of view of political ethics is a great sophism. A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never therefore created any civilization of any kind. Wildly racist and still something you will read on 4chan or Twitter. We wanted to refute the slanders on the basis of scientific truth. For this, we needed more ammunition and better weapons, particularly in the field of history. It was about this time that I met George Wells Parker, a brilliant young black graduate student from Omaha's Creighton University. I was introduced to him by my brother Otto, who had known him in Omaha. He was in Chicago to visit relatives and to conduct research for his dissertation. His major was history, I believe. We found him a virtual storehouse of knowledge on the race question, especially black history. His major objective in life was apparently to refute the prevalent racist lies and to build black dignity and pride. He possessed wide knowledge and seemed to have read everything. Parker called our attention to the writings of the great anthropologist Franz Boas, the Egyptologist Virchow, to Max Muller, philologist who formulated the Aryan myth and then rejected it, to the Frenchman Jean Finot, to Sir Henry Johnstone, British authority on African history, and to the Italian Giuseppe Serge and his theory of the Mediterranean races, a refutation of the Aryan mythology. Proponents of this myth claimed all civilizations, Indian, Near East, Egyptians, as Aryan. One wonders why the Chinese were left out, but then that would have been too palpable a fraud. It was Parker who called our attention to Herodotus, ancient Greek historian, who had described the Egyptians of his time around 400 BC as black and with woolly hair. A white man said it, not me. Herodotus said the Egyptians were black with woolly hair. Herodotus, a white man from Greece, traveling around, just minding his own business, backpacking across Africa, said the Egyptians had black skin and woolly hair. Otto and I introduced Parker to friends and acquaintances, and I, of course, to our discussion circle. He spoke before numerous groups. Everywhere there was hunger for his knowledge. We even brought him before the Bugs Club Forum in Washington Park, where he led a discussion on the race question. This brilliant young man returned to Omaha to resume his studies. The next winter he was dead. Oh, horrific. We heard it was the result of a mental breakdown. I mean, it's the same with most geniuses, right? Most people that are really smart are also dealing with a lot of mental illness too. Thus was a brilliant career cut short and a potentially great scholar lost. Surviving, I believe, was only one brief paper and some notes. This is why it's important to write our stories. We should write our stories. Every black man should plant a tree and write a book. Garvey's Back to Africa movement as we continue chapter 3, but just letting people know we're only going to be reading on live for like a few more minutes, maybe about 20 to 25 more minutes, and then we're going to wrap this up. We'll pick this up tomorrow. Shout out to everybody who's joining the stream now or who has been in rocking with me from the beginning. So, Garvey's Back to Africa movement. But time and tide did not stand still to wait for our answers to the social problems of the day or for the results of our intellectual researches. While we sought arguments with which to counter the racist thrust, the masses were forging their own weapons. Their growing resistance was finally to erupt on the political scene in the greatest mass movement of blacks since Reconstruction. Great masses of blacks found the answer in the Back to Africa program of the West Indian Marcus Garvey. Under his aegis, this movement was eventually diverted from the enemy at home into utopian Zionistic channels of peaceful return to Africa and the establishment of a black state in the ancestral land. By Zionistic, I think he means like returning to a homeland, not actually supporting the state of Israel. The organizational course of the movement was Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. He first launched this organization in Jamaica, British West Indies, in 1914. Coming to the USA, he founded its first section in New York City in 1917. The organization grew rapidly during the war and the immediate post-war period. At its height in the early 20s, it claimed a membership of 500,000. While estimates of the organization's membership vary from 500,000 to 1 million, it was the largest organization in the history of U.S. blacks. Okay. There can be no doubt that its influence extended to millions who identified wholly or partially with its programs. What in Garvey's program attracted these masses? Garvey was a charismatic leader and in that tradition best articulated the sentiments and yearnings of the masses of black people. In his UNIA, he also created the vehicle for their organization. Equally important, he was a master at understanding how to use pageantry, ritual, and ceremony to provide the black peasantry with psychological relief from the daily burdens of their oppression. His apparatus included such high-sounding titles as Potentates, Supreme Deputy Potentate, Knights of the Nile, Knights of Distinguished Service, the Order of Ethiopia, the Dukes of Nigeria and Uganda. There were black gods and black angels and a flag of black, red, and green. Black for the race, red for their blood, and green for their hopes. The movement's program was fully outlined in the historic Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, adopted at the first convention of the organization in New York City, August 13, 1920. In the manner of the Nation of Islam and its publication Muhammad Speaks, Bilalian News, the program of Garvey combined a realistic assessment of the conditions facing blacks with a fantasy and mystification about the solution. Along with the Back to Africa slogan, the document contained a devastating indictment of the plight of black peoples in the United States. Expressing the militancy of its delegates, it called for opposition to the inequality of wages between blacks and whites. It protested their exclusion from unions, their deprivation of land, taxation without representation, unjust military service, and Jim Crow laws. Anticipating the Black Power revolt of the 60s, the document called for complete control of our social institutions without the interference of any other race or races. Reflecting the rising worldwide anti-colonial movement of the period, it called for self-determination of peoples and repudiated the loosely formed League of Nations, declaring its decisions null and void as far as the blacks were concerned because it seeks to deprive them of their independence. This latter point was in reference to the assignment of mandates to European powers over African territories wrested from the Germans. Through this atmosphere of militancy, expressing the desire of the masses to defend their rights at home, ran the incongruent theme of Back to Africa, declared Garvey. Being satisfied to drink of the dregs from the cup of human progress will not demonstrate our fitness as a people to exist alongside others. But when of our own initiative we strike out to build industries, governments, and ultimately empires, then and only then will we as a race prove to our Creator and to man in general that we are fit to survive and capable of shaping our own destiny. Wake up, Africa. Let us work toward the one glorious end of a free, redeemed, and mighty nation. Let Africa be a bright star among the constellation of nations. Who were Garvey's followers? Garvey's Zionistic message was beamed mainly to the submerged black peasantry, especially its uprooted vanguard, the new migrants in such industrial centers as New York City, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and St. Louis. These masses made up the rank and file of the movement. They were embittered and disillusioned by racist terror and unemployment, and saw in Garvey's program of Back to Africa the fulfillment of their yearnings for land and freedom to be guaranteed by a government of their own. On the other hand, Garveyism was the trend of a section of the ghetto lower middle classes, small businessmen, shopkeepers, property holders who were pushed to the wall, ruined or threatened with ruin by the ravages of the post-war crisis. Also attracted to Garveyism were the frustrated and unemployed black intelligentsia, professionals, doctors, lawyers with impoverished clientele, storefront preachers who had followed their flocks to the promised land of the North, and poverty-stricken students. Garveyism reflected the desperation of these strata before the ruthless encroachments of predatory white corporate interests upon their already meager markets. It reflected an attempt by them to escape from the sharpening racist oppression, the terror of race riots, the lynchings, economic and social frustrations. It was from these strata that the movement drew its leadership cadres. The immediate pecuniary interests of this element were expressed in the form of ghetto enterprises, the organization of a whole network of cooperative enterprises, including grocery stores, laundries, restaurants, hotels, and printing plants. The most ambitious was the Black Star steamship line. Several ships were purchased and trade relations were established with groups in the West Indies and Africa, including the Republic of Liberia. The New York City division comprised a large segment of the intensely nationalistic West Indian immigrants. West Indians were prominent in the leadership, in Garvey's close coterie, and in the organization's inner councils. There can be no doubt of the considerable influence of this element on the organization. But the attempt on the part of some writers to brand the movement as a foreign import with no indigenous roots is superficial and without foundation, in fact. See, I didn't know that. I didn't know that the Garvey movement was mostly led by West Indians. The way the story is mostly told about Marcus Garvey is that he got kicked out of Jamaica, came to America, and flourished because black Americans cling to the message of black nationalism. I did not know that, he went to New York City and grabbed a bunch of other Barbadians, Jamaicans, Dominicans, etc., and put them into leadership. I didn't know that. All right. But the attempt on the part of some writers to brand the movement as a foreign import with no indigenous roots is superficial and without foundation. In fact, it is clear that Garveyism had both a social and economic base in black society of the 20s. Nor was Garvey's nationalism a new trend among blacks. Nationalistic currents had repeatedly emerged, going back even before the Civil War. A key role in the movement was also played by deeply disillusioned black veterans who had fought an illusory battle to make the world safe for democracy, only to return to continued and even harsher slavery. Veterans were involved in setting up of the skeleton army of the future African state, and in such paramilitary organizations as the Universal African Legion, the Universal Black Cross Nurses, the African Motor Corps, and the Black Eagle Flying Corps. Many black radicals, even some socialistically inclined, were swept into the Garvey movement, attracted by its militancy. Despite his hostility toward local communists, Garvey seemed to regard the Soviet experience with some favor, at least in the early years of his movement. This probably reflected the sentiments of many of his followers. As late as 1924, in an editorial in the Negro World, he publicly mourned the passing of Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, calling him probably the world's greatest man between 1917 and 1924. On that occasion, he sent a cable to Moscow expressing the sorrow and condolences of the 400 million Negroes of the world. The Garvey movement revealed the wide rift between the policies of the traditional upper class of the NAACP and associates and the life needs of the sorely oppressed people. It represented a mass rejection of the policies and programs of this leadership, which during the war had built up false hopes and now offered no tangible proposals for meeting the rampant anti-black violence and joblessness of the post-war period. This mood was expressed by Garvey, who denounced the whole upper-class leadership, claiming that they were motivated solely by the drive for assimilation and banked their hopes for equality on the support of whites, all classes of whom, he contended, were the black man's enemy. The policy of this leadership, he maintained, was a policy of compromise. The way Harry Haywood is framing Marcus Garvey, he makes him sound like Donald Trump, like somebody who spoke to the needs of the poor and forgotten man, right? And who was subverting the power of the, bourgeoisie vanguard elite who were supposed to lead the race to the promised land. Harry Haywood makes Marcus Garvey sound like MAGA to some degree. So, and most populist movements overlap in that sense, where they appeal to the working class, the poor, the not as educated, etc. But they also capture a wide swath of people too. So that's why in Garvey's movement, the base was mostly the proletariat, but you would also have sprinkled in bourgeoisie elements. So it was in these conditions that Garvey, as a spokesman for the new ghetto petty bourgeoisie, seized leadership of the incipient black revolt and diverted it into the blind alley of utopian escapism. My contact with the movement was limited. I had never seen Garvey. I had missed his appearance in 1919 at the 8th Regiment Armory. I never visited the organization's Liberty Hall headquarters. In Chicago, the movement seemed to spring up. Overnight. I took serious notice of it in 1920. I listened to its orators on street corners, watched its spectacular parades through the South Side streets. The black, red, and green flag of the movement was carried at the head of the parade. The parades were lively and snappy. Marching were the African Legion and the Universal Black Cross Nurses in their spotless white uniforms and white veils. All marched in step with the band. It was quite impressive, but to me it was unreal and had little or no relevance to the actual problems that confronted blacks. From the first, the Garvey movement met heavy opposition in Chicago. The powerful Chicago Defender, edited by Robert S. Abbott, took the lead. If not the world's greatest weekly, as its masthead proclaimed, it had great influence among Chicago and Southern blacks, due to its role in promoting the migration to the North. It was widely read in the South, where a daily newspaper of Athens, Georgia, called it the greatest disturbing element that has yet entered Georgia. The Defender was relentless in its attack, throwing scorn and contempt on the movement and Garvey himself. In addition to the Defender's attacks, the so-called Abyssinia affair in the summer of 1920 served to discredit the movement. The Star Order of Ethiopia and Ethiopian missionaries to Abyssinia was an extremist split-off from Chicago's UNIA branch. The leaders of this group held a parade and rally on 35th and Indiana. Speakers clad in loud African costume called upon the crowd to return to their African ancestral land. To show their scorn for the U.S., they burned an American flag, and when white policemen sought to intervene, the Abyssinians shot and killed 2 white men and wounded a 3rd. Okay, that's gangster. That's gangster. Burn the American flag, and then handle your business if anybody got something to say. I like that. I like that. This incident was blown up in the white press as an armed rebellion by blacks. It was condemned on all sides in the black community and by its leaders, including the editors of the Defender, who helped authorities in capturing the Abyssinian dissidents. Despite its repudiation by the official Garvey organization, the Abyssinian affair served to muddy the Garvey image in Chicago. I was working on the New York Central at the time and heard a graphic account of the affair from my aunts when I arrived in town the next day. They lived right around the corner on Indiana Avenue. Despite the hostile black press and the Abyssinian affair, the UNIA grew. At its height, it claimed a Chicago membership of 9,000 devoted followers. This is probably exaggerated, but there is no doubt that the sympathizers numbered in the tens of thousands. Our Sunday discussion group underestimated the significance of the Garvey movement and the strength it was later to reveal. We regarded it as a transient phenomenon. We applauded some of the cultural aspects of the movement. Garvey's emphasis on race, pride, dignity, self-reliance, his exaltation of things black. This was all to the good. This was all to the good. I didn't know back then our ancestors were saying this was all to the good. That's like reading in this text like, yo, shit's lit right now. Like if Harry Haywood says shit was lit back then, boy, we were catching the vibe. I'm going to fall out of my chair. Anyway, this was all to the good, we felt. However, we rejected in its entirety the Back to Africa program as fantastic, unreal, and a dangerous diversion which could only lead to desertion of the struggle for our rights in the USA. This was our country, we strongly felt, and blacks should not waive their just claims to equality and justice in the land to whose wealth and greatness we and our forefathers had made such great contributions. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Finally, we could not go along with Garvey's idea about inherent racial antagonisms between black and white. This to us seemed equivalent to ceding the racist enemy one of his main points. While it is true that I personally often wavered in the direction of race against race, I was not prepared to accept the idea as a philosophy. It did not jibe with my experience with whites. While rejecting Garvey's program, our ideas for a viable alternative were still vague and unformed. The most important effect that the Garvey movement had on us was that it put into clear focus the questions to which we sought answers. Who were the enemies of the black freedom struggle? While Garvey claimed the entire white race was the enemy, it did not escape us that he was inconsistent, being soft on white capitalists. His main target was clearly white labor and the trade union movement. According to Garvey, it seems strange and a paradox, but the only convenient friend the Negro worker or laborer has in America at the present time is the white capitalist. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. Marcus Garvey would get laughed out of the building if I had the microphone. Are you serious? The white capitalist is the friend to the black man? The same white capitalists who are the sons of the former white capitalists who bought us? No. Anyway, the capitalist, being selfish, seeking only the largest profit out of labor, is willing and glad to use Negro labor wherever possible on a scale reasonably below the standard white union wage. So Marcus Garvey was willingly selling us into wage slavery, or seeing that as a positive thing. Hey, don't worry, the rich whites are giving you a job. It might be not enough money, it might not actually be enough to feed you or your family, but at least you got a job. Sad. But if the Negro unionizes himself to the level of the white worker, the choice and preference of employment is given to the white worker. If the Negro takes my advice, he will organize by himself and always keep his scale of wage a little lower than the whites until he is able to become, through proper leadership, his own employer. By doing so, he will keep the goodwill of the white employer and live a little longer under the present scheme of things. So many things wrong with that. So many things wrong with that. There's no time to even get into it because we're going to be wrapping this up soon. So there is no doubt that Garvey was voicing the sentiments of the vast mass of new migrant workers. And it was not that we had any strike breaking in industries from which blacks were barred. In fact, that had been one of the ways blacks broke into the industries, such as stockyards and steel. We were also keenly aware of the Jim Crow policies of the existing trade union leadership and of the anti-black prejudices rampant among white workers. But in casting blacks permanently into the role of strikebreakers, Garvey was helping to further divide an already polarized situation and playing into the hands of businessmen, bankers, factory owners, and the reactionary leadership of the trade unions. All right. Marcus Garvey was a diamond. There's a lot we like about Marcus Garvey, but this right here, no. This we cannot approve, in my opinion. We cannot approve of the idea that we are going to be willingly exploitable labor to white capitalists as a way to lift the race. That's just crazy. Marcus Garvey had a lot of good ideas, but that one, that's not it. I'm going to see how much we have left in the Marcus Garvey chapter. Okay, so we have quite a lot left in the Marcus Garvey section. So we're not going to finish that up. We'll finish that up tomorrow during our reading. So we're going to go back here. We're going to pick up on page 108. We're already on page 108 of the book Black Bolshevik, Autobiography of an Afro-American Communist. I'm liking chapter 3 as well. It's still the same writing style, very well written, a lot of history, a lot of game, a lot of stuff that you won't pick up in other books. And so I really like this book a lot. Shout out to Haywood for putting this together. And yeah, we're going to be reading tomorrow, so stay tuned, turn on the notifications. Shout out to Kamal for jumping in the chat and Akdi as well. Y'all be easy out there, and catch you on the playback.